The silence of the Forbidden City did not belong to the gods, nor to the ancestors. It belonged to the Emperor's shadow, and he was sweating. The air in the Imperial Library was thick with the scent of aged silk, powdered ink, and a profound, bone-deep fear. John, a servant barely 20 years old, with hands calloused from endless labor and a face designed for obscurity, worked in the shadowy heart of the Son of Heaven's domain. He was a Shu Ren, a keeper of books, a position of minimal prestige but maximum peril. His duty was to categorize and preserve the endless scrolls of the Imperial archives, an innocuous task for a man carrying a secret that was anything but. Tonight, under the watchful, unblinking eyes of the stone lions outside, John was not sorting histories, he was defying them. He stood before a towering lacquer-black cabinet in the library's restricted annex. This annex, known only as the Archive of Forgotten Records, was sealed by the Emperor's personal mandate. No one entered except for the chief scholar, who was conveniently, or suspiciously, away on an extended mission to the southern provinces. This left John, the lowly servant, as the sole guardian of its lock. The seal, a piece of dark, polished obsidian, was pressed into the cabinet door. It depicted a writhing ancient dragon coiled around the imperial family crest, a symbol of eternal authority. John's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached inside the wide sleeve of his simple gray tunic and pulled out a small copper instrument. It was a lock-picking tool, an item he had spent months forging in secret, not in the royal workshops, but in the forgotten utility tunnels beneath the kitchen. The moment he inserted the tip into the seal's intricate mechanism, the silence of the library became a roaring void. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind outside sounded like approaching footsteps. He thought of the penalty for trespassing here. Death by 1,000 cuts, a slow and agonizing public spectacle. And for discovering the secret he was hunting, something far, far worse. Clink. The lock sprang open. John held his breath, waiting for an alarm that never sounded. The power of the dynasty resided in its rituals, its history, its unquestioned mandate. This lock was the physical embodiment of that, and he had broken it with a bent piece of copper. He swung the cabinet door inward, revealing not scrolls of administrative law or poetry, but a deep, hidden recess lined with velvet. Inside, a single, small wooden box rested. It was made of Huanghuali wood, famous for its rich, swirling grain, and it looked utterly unassuming. John's fingers trembled as he lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked, solid and inert. He placed it gently on the reading desk, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. Satisfied he was alone, he fumbled with the clasp. The box opened with a faint whoosh of escaping ancient air. Inside, nestled on crimson silk, was not a scroll nor a jewel, but a single, brittle, sun-bleached bone. It was a small, strangely shaped shard, no bigger than his thumb, etched with a single, deeply scored character, Qin, the name of the dynasty that came before the current one, the one the emperor claimed to have rightfully and divinely overthrown 2 centuries ago. But what truly stole John's breath, what made the blood freeze in his veins, was the tiny piece of silk wrapped around the bone. It was dyed in the exact, forbidden shade of imperial yellow, the color reserved only for the Son of Heaven. Unfurling the silk with painstaking care, John held it to the faint light of his hidden lantern. The writing on the silk was in the Emperor's own, unmistakable hand, a hasty, panicked scrawl. The bone, the blood, a lie that binds. Keep it hidden, or the Qian will rise. The mandate is broken. John stared at the fragment. The current emperor, the mighty ruler of the great Yu dynasty, a man whose lineage was supposedly blessed by heaven itself, was acknowledging that his very right to rule was a sham. The bone was the key, the symbol of an unbroken lineage from the previous dynasty, suggesting the current imperial family were not the true inheritors of the mandate of heaven. They were usurpers. The revelation struck John with the force of a thunderbolt. His master, the chief scholar and his secret mentor, was not merely tasked with preserving history, he was tasked with preserving a lie. A noise outside, the unmistakable clink of an armored boot on the courtyard stone, snapped him back to the present. The Emperor's personal guard, patrolling early. He had seconds. John quickly wrapped the bone in the silk, placed the box back in the recess, and swung the heavy cabinet door shut, the obsidian seal clicking back into place. He was locking away the truth, but the truth was now locked inside him. He was no longer just a servant. He was the only man in the imperial city who knew the emperor was a fraud and that the single bone he now guarded was the explosive core that could shatter the dynasty into dust. The clink was closer now, accompanied by the measured, heavy tread of military boots. John's blood pulsed in his ears, drowning out the faint night sounds of the imperial city. The patrol was approaching the archive of forgotten records. His only exit lay past them, down the long, moon-drenched central courtyard. He had locked the secret away, but the scent of his intrusion lingered like a phantom in the still air. He had to vanish. John snatched the small copper lock-picking tool and tucked it deeply into a hidden seam in his sleeve. He extinguished the tiny oil lamp, plunging the annex back into a total, oppressive darkness. In the brief, panicked moment of light-to-dark transition, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the obsidian seal, the dragon and the imperial crest, silent sentinels of the lie. He slipped from the annex and rejoined the main, cavernous hall of the imperial library. The main hall was a labyrinth of 6-foot-tall wooden shelves, a forest of archived history. John flattened himself against a pillar, his chest heaving, listening. The footsteps stopped directly outside the main library doors. A rough voice, colder than the midnight air, broke the silence. "Clear the perimeter. I want to see dust on the souls of the stone lions. No loitering." This was Captain Wei, known less for his loyalty and more for his predatory efficiency. Wei was a man whose ambition was a palpable aura, a sword perpetually half-drawn, always hunting for a chance to prove his indispensability to the emperor.
Jian knew he couldn't wait. If Wei or his men entered the library, they wouldn't just look for shadows. They'd look for things that were out of place. A slightly misplaced scroll, a disturbance in the fine layer of dust that coated everything static. With the agility born of years of navigating the palace's back corridors and service tunnels, Jian began to move. He didn't run, he flowed. His soft cloth shoes made no sound on the polished jade floor. He moved not as a man, but as a flicker of shadow between the immense shelves, using the vertical lines of the book spines as cover. He was aiming for the north service door, a small, inconspicuous exit used by the cleaning staff, which led to a narrow alleyway behind the kitchens. Just as he reached the halfway point, a ray of light split the darkness. The main doors were pushed open, and 2 guards, encased in polished black lacquer armor, stepped inside, their faces hidden by grim iron helms. Captain Wei remained outside, his figure silhouetted against the courtyard light. "Search the central aisles," Wei commanded from the doorway. "See if the rats have been chewing on the Emperor's history." John froze. He was hidden by a shelf containing the entire recorded genealogy of the imperial family. Ironically, the very documentation that housed the grand lie was now his shield. One of the guards, a burly man who moved with tired reluctance, passed John's position, less than 3 feet away. John held his breath, the taste of dust from the old scrolls coating his mouth. He focused only on the whoosh of the guard's tunic, the creak of his armor. He must find a distraction. John noticed a small, beautifully carved jade inkwell resting precariously on the top shelf, long forgotten by the scholars. It was not valuable, but its fall would be loud. He slowly reached up, straining his fingers until he just managed to nudge the inkwell. It tumbled. Clatter! The jade shattered on the stone floor, the sound echoing sharply in the silence of the library. "What was that?" Wei's voice was sharp, immediate. The first guard spun around, drawing his short service blade. "Noise came from the far aisle, Captain. Sounded like a fall." "Go," Wei ordered. "Secure the area." The two guards immediately moved toward the source of the sound, their attention diverted. This was Jian's chance. While the guards were distracted by the shattered jade and searching the wrong aisle, he sprinted the remaining distance to the north service door. He fumbled with the simple iron latch, his hands shaking, but the years of practice under pressure served him well. He slipped through the door, closing it softly, and found himself in the narrow, damp alleyway behind the kitchens. He didn't stop. He ran, hugging the shadows of the high imperial walls until he reached the familiar, chaotic safety of the lower servants' quarters. He collapsed on his straw pallet in the stifling, crowded room he shared with 10 other low-ranking palace workers. He was safe for now. But he felt utterly exposed. He knew too much. His breathing gradually slowed, yet the image of the Emperor's panicked scrawl, "The mandate is broken," burned behind his eyelids. The secret wasn't just a threat to the Emperor. It was a deadly weapon that now resided within his own heart. He was no longer just protecting the lie. He was, unwittingly, protecting the very truth that could save or destroy them all. The next morning, the Forbidden City hummed with its usual mechanical precision. But for Jian, every routine sound was a threat. He moved through his duties, fetching water, lighting braziers, dusting ancient scrolls, with a forced, almost robotic stillness. He had to be invisible, an empty vessel, yet his mind was screaming with the weight of the kin bone and the Emperor's panicked secret. His task for the day was near the library's entrance, when the news rippled through the staff like a chill wind. Chief Scholar Huang had returned, 2 weeks early and without prior notice. Huang was more than Jian's employer. He was the man who had plucked Jian from the grime of the palace kitchens, taught him to read, and, most importantly, entrusted him with the secret of the archive's special lock. Huang was the architect of the lie, and Jian was now his reluctant accomplice. A few hours later, Huang swept into the library. He was a man of 60, frail of body but possessed of an immense scholarly presence. His long official robes flowed around him, and his eyes, normally twinkling with intellectual fire, were deeply recessed, shadowed by exhaustion and worry. Jian bowed low, touching his forehead to the floor as required. "Welcome back, Master Huang. May your travels be blessed." Huang dismissed the other servants with a wave, his voice raspy. "Jian, stand up." Jian rose, maintaining a calm, servile expression. He avoided direct eye contact, a habit of obedience that now served as a convenient mask for his guilt. Huang did not waste time. He walked straight past the history sections, past the poetry, to the door of the archive of forgotten records. He placed his hand on the obsidian seal, pressing his thumb firmly into the cold stone dragon. "Everything in order, Jian?" Huang asked, his tone deceptively soft, like silk wrapped around a blade. Jian knew this was the true test. A single bead of sweat, a stumble in his voice, would be his ruin. "The records are untouched, Master Huang," Jian replied, his voice flat and steady. "I maintained the daily dust barrier outside the door as instructed. The only disturbance was last night, when Captain Wei's patrol broke a jade inkwell in the central aisle while searching for what they called a rat." Jian subtly inserted the truth about the inkwell to explain any potential residual disorder. He didn't lie about the main fact. The seal was intact, and the records were untouched, save for a brief moment he alone witnessed.
Huang turned slowly, his sharp, old eyes finally meeting Jian's. They pierced him, searching for the crack in the facade. "A rat," Huang mused, stepping closer. "Tell me, Jian, did this rat leave anything behind? A scent? A clue?" "Only dust on the floor near the central genealogies, Master," Jian reported. "I swept it this morning. It was nothing to trouble the chief scholar. Huang studied him for a long moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod. He seemed satisfied, or perhaps too tired to probe further. He turned away and walked toward his private office. "Prepare me a pot of the strong pu'er tea, Jean, and do not disturb me." Jean bowed deeply. He had passed the chief scholar's test, for now. The interrogation in the South Hall of Rituals. Jean was carrying the freshly brewed tea toward Huang's office when he was intercepted. "A word, servant." Captain Wei stepped out of a shadowed corridor near the South Hall of Rituals, accompanied by one of his grim-faced armored guards. Wei was in full uniform, his leather belt creaking with the weight of his weapons. His eyes, dark and assessing, held Jean captive. "Captain Wei," Jean acknowledged, bowing politely while keeping the steaming teacup perfectly steady. "I am investigating the minor disturbance last night, a shattered inkwell. Quite a loud sound for a mere accident, wouldn't you agree? It startled me, Captain. The sound was loud in the silence of the night. You were in the library late, Jean. It is your right, but I was curious. Did you perhaps see anything before or after the inkwell fell?" He paused, his gaze fixed on Jean's hands, then the teacup, then Jean's eyes. He wasn't asking about the inkwell. He was probing for fear. He was smelling the scent of disobedience. "I was finishing my late categorization near the Eastern calligraphy collection," Jean explained, remembering exactly where he claimed to be. "I heard the noise and immediately went to see the damage. By the time I arrived, your men were already searching the aisle." "And you were alone?" "Yes, Captain. Only the ancestors were my witness." Wei smiled, a cold, humorless movement of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful, Jean. There are many unseen eyes in this palace, and many ears. If I hear even a whisper of you going where you should not, the fate of a rat will look like a soft pillow." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "The Emperor's secrets are weighty, Jean. They crush those who merely stand near them." Wei gave a final menacing glance and strode away, his guard following. Jean stood there, the weight of the tea service feeling suddenly crushing. He had survived 2 scrutinies in quick succession, the careful examination of the master who knew his habits, and the brute force intimidation of the one who merely smelled danger. But Wei's words echoed the hidden scroll's content too closely. The mandate is broken. Wei clearly suspected something was amiss in the palace's core, even if he didn't know the exact nature of the secret. Jean delivered the tea to Master Huang. Now he needed to know what had brought the chief scholar back so abruptly, and what that ominous return meant for the bone and the dynasty. Jean left the chief scholar's tea on the low table and retreated, but he did not go far. He positioned himself just outside Master Huang's private office door, using a tall ornamental screen as his cover. He knew that the chief scholar's early return was not a coincidence. It was a crisis. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, the heavy, cushioned door of the library swung open, and 2 high-ranking officials entered. The Minister of Rights, a flustered, portly man, and a young, impeccably groomed palace secretary. They carried a sealed box of deep crimson lacquer, the color of official urgency. "Master Huang," the Minister of Rights announced, his voice booming with nervous importance. "The Son of Heaven sends his personal decree. He wishes it known that your mission was a success and that you have returned in time for the seasonal unbinding." Jean, listening intently, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The seasonal unbinding was a critical, ancient ritual. Every autumn, the emperor would preside over the ceremonial unrolling of the Mandate of Heaven scroll, a 200-year-old silk relic that supposedly contained the divinely sanctioned edict granting the Yu dynasty power. The entire court and representatives of all provinces watched this ritual. The young palace secretary placed the crimson box on Huang's desk. "This box contains the scroll, Master Huang. It must be prepared for the ritual in 5 days." "Prepared?" Huang's voice was sharp, cutting through the official veneer. "Its preparation has been the same for 2 centuries. What new duty does His Majesty require of me?" The minister shifted uncomfortably. "The emperor, he desires a subtle enhancement, Master, a restoration. A faint discoloration has been noted at the base of the scroll. His Majesty wishes it to be made absolutely, flawlessly perfect for the viewing. The mandate must appear eternal." The officials departed, leaving the crimson box behind. Jean knew instantly the discoloration was not random. It was a sign of the scroll's age, a sign that its claim of eternity was a lie. This restoration was in order to actively tamper with the dynasty's foundation document. The task. Jean waited until he heard the faint sound of the chief scholar unsealing the crimson box. Then he knocked softly and entered the office. Huang sat hunched over the scroll, his face pale under the lantern light. The Mandate of Heaven scroll was breathtaking, a length of pale, heavy silk inscribed with glittering gold characters. But at the bottom edge, a creeping stain was visible, a dark, earthy shadow that looked almost like dried blood. "You heard them," Huang murmured without looking up. "The emperor is terrified. He is asking me to commit an offense against history itself, to cover up the scroll's decay."
"Master," Jean said quietly, "the discoloration, does it threaten the silk?" Huang sighed, setting his writing brush down. He looked Jean directly in the eyes. "No, Jean, the stain is not decay. It is a warning." He reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small rolled-up sketch. It was a charcoal drawing of the clean bone from the archive of forgotten records. "The bone you saw last night," Huang explained, his voice low. "It is the true imperial seal of the previous Qin dynasty. The emperor's ancestors did not overthrow the Qin. They murdered the infant heir and stole the throne. That bone is proof of the Qin bloodline's survival, proof that our dynasty's mandate is a lie." He tapped the dark stain on the scroll. "This stain appears in a recurring pattern. Look closely." John leaned in. The stain, when viewed with knowledge of the bone, resolved itself into a barely visible, ghostly replication of the bone's unique etched character, Qin. The truth was trying to bleed through the lie. "The lie must be preserved, John," Huang declared, his voice resolute. "Not for the emperor's sake. He is a selfish fool, but for the sake of order. If this truth is revealed, every war-hungry governor, every bandit, every rival clan will rise up. The dynasty will fall into chaos, and millions will die. The lie is the emperor's shadow. It protects the peace." Huang then unveiled his true purpose for returning early. "John, I cannot use imperial pigments to cover this. They will crack and fail. I need a pigment that will bond with the silk for centuries. I need the ghost ink of Mount Li." The ghost ink was a legendary mineral pigment said to be ground from stones deep in the ancient crumbling tomb of the first Qin emperor, the very dynasty they were trying to erase. It was a pigment so remote and dangerous to obtain that no palace official would dare to retrieve it.
I need you to go, John. You are invisible. You are quiet, and you are trusted by me. Retrieve the ghost ink. Only with it can I permanently silence the truth that is trying to surface on this scroll. The chief scholar was sending his servant to the single place that held the most potent memories of the dynasty's stolen past on a mission to secure the dynasty's future. John's secret had just become his pilgrimage. He was the only person who could bridge the gap between the truth in the archive and the lie on the scroll. I understand, Master, John said, settling his gaze on the menacing red box. I will prepare immediately. John had 5 days to travel 300 miles, retrieve an illegal mineral pigment from an imperial tomb, and return. The math alone was terrifying. He could not travel with the speed of an official courier who would attract too much attention, nor could he simply walk out of the Forbidden City. He spent the remainder of the day planning his escape. His anonymity, usually a curse, was now his greatest asset. He was a servant, and servants were expendable and invisible. He gathered his supplies, 2 days' worth of dried steamed bread, a water pouch, a simple rope, and the most crucial item, a finely detailed hand-drawn map of the secondary drainage system beneath the city, given to him years ago by the chief scholar as a study aid. Under the cover of dusk, as the hundreds of palace staff settled into their crowded sleeping quarters, John feigned illness. He wrapped himself in a thin blanket, coughing lightly, and endured the stifling heat until the common room finally fell into the uneasy silence of mass exhaustion. Around the second watch, when the patrolling guards were at their most predictable, John slipped out. The passage beneath. His route led him to the kitchen refuse courtyard, a place of stench and grime, but thankfully light. The large stone slabs that covered the main drainage tunnel were heavy, but John had studied the mechanics of the city's underbelly for years. He pried open the necessary seam using a long iron lever intended for stirring large cooking pots. The air that rushed up was fetid, but it was freedom. John lowered himself into the dark passage. The tunnel, barely tall enough for him to stoop in, was slick with cold, moving water and littered with centuries of discarded waste. It was a suffocating, terrifying journey, but it led out the dragon's mouth, past the massive outer walls of the Forbidden City. For an hour, John crawled and waded, guided only by the faint, earthy smell of the countryside growing stronger. Finally, the tunnel began to slope upward. He found the egress point, a grate hidden by overgrown bamboo near a neglected watchtower, and pushed. The grate was stiff, but John, energized by desperation, forced it open. He emerged into the cool, silent air of the countryside behind the Imperial Hunting Park. He scraped the grime from his clothes and tied his few possessions tightly to his waist. He was out, he was free, and he was utterly exposed. The unexpected traveler. John began his trek south, sticking to the shadows of the secondary roads and paths. He traveled through the night, pushing his body past exhaustion, knowing that every minute was a minute closer to the ritual. Just before dawn, hiding in a small copse of pine trees to sleep for a few hours, John heard the approach of a traveler on the main road. He flattened himself into the undergrowth. The traveler was not a merchant or a soldier, but a woman. She rode a modest donkey, laden with bags of herbs and medicine, dressed in the simple, dusty robes of a nomadic healer. She stopped right beside John's hiding spot, pulled a small clay teapot from her saddlebag, and began to light a small fire for morning tea. Suddenly, she looked directly into the pine copse. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, rested exactly on him. "You should not sleep in the cold, city dweller," she said. her voice surprisingly gentle but firm. "It will settle in your bones. Come, share my tea. You look as though you've been eating mud." Jian realized he had been seen. Trying to flee would only confirm his suspicious nature. He rose slowly, brushing pine needles from his tunic. "Forgive me, honored traveler," Jian said, bowing. "I am a humble servant, traveling to visit an ailing relative. I was merely resting." The woman, she introduced herself simply as May, poured him a cup of hot herbal tea. It was bracing and instantly dissolved the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. "A servant running from the city," May observed, taking a sip. "And yet you carry no gifts, no coin, and you clutch your tunic as if you've stolen a jewel. You are running from something more than sickness, I think." Jian froze, the cup halfway to his lips. Her perception was unnerving. He was an invisible man, yet she saw straight through him. "I carry no such thing," Jian insisted, forcing a smile. May merely raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Very well, but if you travel south, you should know the main road is now blocked near the village of Wuyang. Captain Wei's patrols have been activated. They are hunting a specific runaway, a thief, they claim, who took a precious item of state." Jian felt his blood run cold. Captain Wei was already closing the net. The emperor, or perhaps the chief scholar himself, had already declared the theft to justify the military presence. He was not just running from suspicion, he was now officially a hunted fugitive. "My path leads away from Wuyang," Jian lied, finishing the tea quickly. "Good, because those patrols are not looking for a jewel. They are looking for a secret." May mounted her donkey, paused, and looked back at Jian. "Safe journey, servant, but a man who carries a burden that heavy should never travel the main road alone." With that cryptic warning, May rode off, leaving Jian standing alone on the cold, dusty path, the bitter taste of truth replacing the herbal sweetness of the tea. He had to change his route immediately, and he now had the chilling realization that the chief scholar, or perhaps Captain Wei himself, had wasted no time in making him the dynasty's official scapegoat. The warning from May, the nomadic healer, was a gift Jian couldn't afford to ignore. Captain Wei's patrols, searching for a thief, meant the main roads were death traps. Jian immediately turned east, away from the bustling thoroughfare, plunging into the wilderness that separated the imperial heartland from the distant mountains. This path was treacherous, overgrown trails, rocky terrain, and dense thickets of bamboo that snapped underfoot, broadcasting his presence. He traveled for 3 relentless days and a night, subsisting on his meager rations and the bitter fear that spurred his legs onward. His hands, usually deft with ink and silk, were scraped and bleeding from climbing treacherous slopes. The hunter and the prey. By the 3rd morning, Jian had reached the foothills of Mount Li, a majestic, desolate range famous for 2 things: the endless quarries that provided stone for the imperial city, and the hidden tomb of the first Qin emperor. He stopped at a small stream to drink and found a chilling sign: a fresh set of military boot prints, distinct from the smooth soles of his own cloth shoes, pressed into the damp bank. Wei's patrols were not merely blocking the main roads, they were actively hunting through the wilderness, perhaps guessing that a palace servant wouldn't risk open travel. Jian realized he couldn't keep running. He had to think like the hunters. He climbed a rocky outcrop, surveying the land below. He noticed that the boot prints vanished at the edge of a deep, misty ravine. If the guards believed he was too terrified to descend into the ravine, they would circle around it, trying to cut him off on the other side. It was a risk, but it was his only chance to gain ground. Jian secured his supplies and began the perilous descent into the ravine. The air was colder here, heavy with moisture, and the sound of rushing water masked any noise he made. The truth underfoot. As he navigated the unstable rock face, Jian's thoughts drifted back to the chief scholar Huang. Huang was a man dedicated to order above all else. He was willing to uphold the lie to prevent widespread bloodshed. But was that truly Jian's burden to carry? He thought of the small, bleached Qin bone locked away in the forbidden archive, the silent proof that the mandate of heaven was broken. Did the people deserve a stable peace built on a lie, or did they deserve the chaos of a truth that could set them free? As he pondered this ethical chasm, his foot slipped on a loose piece of shale. He grabbed desperately for a vine, steadying himself just as the shale slid away, revealing a small, smooth piece of green-streaked rock beneath. It was jade, but not the polished jade of the palace. This was rough-cut jade, clearly part of a massive, broken structure. Jian felt a shiver of recognition. He was already close. The burial complexes of the Qin dynasty were vast, rumored to stretch for miles beneath the mountainside, their entrances sealed and forgotten centuries ago. He pocketed the shard of jade. It was a tangible piece of the very dynasty he was trying to erase. An omen. Exiting the ravine hours later, Jian was exhausted, but had successfully bypassed the visible patrol routes. He was now deep in the quietest, most rugged part of Mount Li. He spotted his goal, a cluster of unusually shaped boulders, long known to local quarry workers as the Sleeping Dragons. Legends whispered that this formation marked the true entrance to the first emperor's unplundered subterranean palace. As he approached the boulders, he was startled by a flash of vivid color. Resting on a cracked stone altar, a shrine long abandoned by local villagers, was a brilliantly red ribbon tied to a small, fresh sprig of pine. It was a ritual offering. This wasn't placed by a quarry worker or a wandering traveler. It was a recent offering, left by someone with knowledge of the Qin legacy. Someone who respected this place. Jian quickly scanned the surroundings. Had Captain Wei's patrols found this place? No, the patrols would have trampled and defiled a forbidden shrine. He remembered Mei, the perceptive healer, and her specific warning about the patrols. Could this be a marker? A sign from someone who knew his secret path? He approached the altar cautiously. He lifted the pine sprig. Tied beneath the red ribbon, nestled securely in the altar's shadow, was a small, crudely drawn map on parchment. It was not a map of the above-ground trails, but of the underground tunnel system, a key to navigating the labyrinthine passages of the Qin tomb complex. A note was scrawled at the bottom of the parchment in swift, elegant characters. The shadow protects the light. Jian looked back the way he came. He was being watched, and someone, perhaps the insightful healer Mei, perhaps someone else entirely, was guiding his steps, confirming his path toward the forbidden, explosive core of the past. He was the Emperor's shadow, but he now realized he was not alone in the dark.
The cluster of boulders known as the Sleeping Dragons was not merely a landmark. It concealed a cleverly disguised vertical shaft. Using the rough map and a length of sturdy rope, John located the hidden lever, a camouflage piece of stone designed to look like a dragon scale. He pulled it, and a section of rock slowly, agonizingly ground open, revealing a black, damp void. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, untouched by sunlight for 200 years, smelling faintly of sulfur and cold clay. John secured his rope and began his descent. The silent army. The shaft dropped nearly 50 feet before widening into a massive, echoing chamber. This was not the legendary main tomb, but a peripheral chamber dedicated to the first emperor's ritual guard. John landed silently on the earthen floor. The chamber was overwhelming. Thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers stood in flawless, silent formation, their painted features long faded, their spears and crossbows poised for an invasion that would never come. Their stillness was more menacing than any live guard. John consulted the hidden map. It guided him through a precise path within the terracotta ranks, indicating where traps were buried or where the floor was unstable. It was clear the map was drawn by someone with intimate, perhaps ancestral knowledge of the tomb's complex defenses. He moved among the clay warriors, his heart pounding in time with his footsteps, each step a violation of 2 centuries of peace. He reached a passage marked on the map as the Path of 9 Sorrows. The entrance was sealed by a thick bronze door, its surface oxidized green with age. The blade trap. The map showed a series of pressure plates leading to the door. John knelt, his keeper of books training lending him a delicate touch. He used a long, slender bamboo rod, testing the stone floor ahead. Click. He found the first pressure plate. He saw a microscopic gap in the ceiling tiles just above the plate, a trigger for a trap. He bypassed it by placing his weight on the surrounding unburdened stones, moving with agonizing slowness. On the 3rd step, the silence was shattered. Swoosh! A massive rusted iron blade, nearly 5 feet long, swung out from the wall, narrowly missing John's head and embedding itself with a sickening thud into the terracotta shoulder of a nearby soldier. The impact cracked the clay armor, and the soldier's head rolled onto the ground. The sound echoed violently. John flattened himself against the cold wall, gasping. He was shaking, not just from fear, but from the sudden, brute realization of the Qin emperor's ruthlessness. Even in death, this dynasty killed intruders with casual brutality. He retrieved the blade he'd nearly lost and continued, his focus now absolute. He used the blade as an extended probe, sweeping the path ahead, relying on the map as a guide, but his instincts as his final defense. The ghost ink. Finally, he reached the small, unassuming chamber carved directly into the bedrock. This was the place marked on the map. It held no riches, no artifacts, only a single, low stone pedestal. On the pedestal lay a thick, heavy pestle and a shallow carved stone mortar. Next to the mortar was a deposit of mineral rock. It was a dark, silvery blue pigment, glittering even in the faint light of his lamp. This was the ghost ink of Mount Lee, a mineral rich in sulfides and ancient clay, capable of binding permanently with organic materials like silk. John knelt before the pedestal. He wasn't stealing riches. He was stealing the silence needed to maintain the current era. He grabbed the pestle and began to grind the mineral. The stone-on-stone friction produced a thin, crystalline powder that shimmered like moonlight. He worked quickly, scooping the finished powder into a small, prepared silk pouch, securing it tightly. He had the ghost ink. The instrument of the great deception was now in his possession. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught an inscription carved into the back of the pedestal, nearly invisible in the gloom. It was a single defiant phrase, likely carved by the ancient artisans forced to build the tomb. The truth is not buried, it is merely waiting. John stared at the phrase. The bone in the archive, the stain on the scroll, the ancient tomb, and the ink in his hand, all were part of a vast, desperate struggle between past and present. The dynasty's shadow was about to be cast permanently over the light of the truth. He secured the pouch of ghost ink inside his tunic, right next to the small copper pick that had started this entire ordeal. Now he faced the far more dangerous task, exiting the tomb and evading Captain Way's patrols, all before the ritual in less than 2 days. John retraced his steps out of the tomb, the small pouch of shimmering ghost ink burning a hole against his chest.
His escape from Mount Lee was quicker, but infinitely riskier than his entry. He abandoned the ravine, using the cover of dense early morning mist, and focusing solely on speed. He was halfway to the Forbidden City's outer walls when he decided to return through the same drainage system. The closer he got to the capital, the thicker the patrols became. He chose a route through the overgrown Imperial Hunting Park, a forbidden area, but one with thick foliage that offered better concealment than the open roads. The ambush. John was sprinting across a small clearing when he heard the unmistakable thwack of a bowstring. A moment later, an arrow slammed into the trunk of a willow tree just inches from his head, the feathered end still vibrating violently. "Hold! Imperial servant, you are under arrest!" Captain Wei stepped out from the shadows of the forest, flanked by 4 armored guards. Wei's face was grimy and drawn, showing the strain of the relentless hunt. He wasn't hunting a thief, he was hunting a clue, and he knew John was the key. "I thought I smelled a rat straying from the sewer," Wei sneered, slowly drawing his ornate military sword. The sword was massive, designed not just to kill, but to intimidate. "I warned you, John, the Emperor's secrets crush those who stand too close." John stopped, raising his empty hands. He knew fighting was useless. His only defense was his mind. "I am merely returning to my duty, Captain," John said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "I traveled to the countryside to receive a rare pigment for the Chief Scholar's restoration work." "A pigment?" Wei laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "A palace servant traveling hundreds of miles alone for pigment. Such loyalty! You will tell that fairy tale to the magistrate. My men found evidence of tampering near the restricted archive. You ran right after." Wei stepped closer, the tip of his sword pointing directly at John's throat. "What did you steal? Is it gold, a jewel, or is it something written?"
John knew that if Wei discovered the ghost ink, he would seize it and use it to blackmail the chief scholar, or worse, expose the whole scandal to the Emperor in a bid for power. John had to protect the ink and the lie it was meant to perpetuate. "You misunderstand, Captain," John said, his eyes locking with Wei's. "I am an Imperial shadow. I run on orders. You are wasting the Emperor's time and manpower chasing a lie." He took a calculated risk, dropping a small polished stone he'd picked up earlier near Mount Lee. "If you think I stole something valuable, search me. I have nothing but the dust of the road and my obedience." Wei hesitated. He was ambitious, but also a man of calculated risk. He was hunting a palace scandal, not a common bandit. If Jian truly was acting under the chief scholar's mandate, arresting him might be a career-ending offense against a powerful court minister. "Search him," Wei commanded his guards. The cost of obedience. The guards roughly pinned Jian against the willow tree, tearing open his tunic. They found his small purse of dried bread, his tattered water pouch, and nothing else. Jian had secured the pouch of ghost ink in the most unlikely place, hidden inside the lining of his boot underneath a protective layer of padding. The guards, searching only for objects of obvious value, missed it. They stepped back, reporting failure. Wei was furious. He knew he was right, but he lacked the proof. He glared at Jian, his eyes narrowed with lethal suspicion. "You are dismissed," Wei spat, sheathing his sword with a loud clang. "But I will be watching you, keeper of books. If I find a single misstep, a single wrong character in the history you guard, I will personally ensure your execution is the first line of the new decree." Wei and his men turned and marched back into the woods, their hunt thwarted, but their vigilance redoubled. Jian did not move until the sounds of their footsteps had completely faded. His body ached, his face was bruised, and he was trembling. He had stared down death and won, but he had solidified his position as the chief scholar's most vulnerable pawn.
He pulled the pouch of ghost ink from his boot. It was damp, but the powder was intact. He was now a true fugitive, relying solely on his wits and his invisibility within the vast palace walls. His final and most dangerous journey began now, sneaking back into the Forbidden City and reaching the chief scholar before the hour of the great ritual. Jian re-entered the Forbidden City just as the third watch ended, the darkest, quietest hour before dawn. He used the drainage tunnel system again, emerging near the imperial kitchens, smelling of grime and the cold, earthy air of the outside world. He moved swiftly to the imperial library. The great hall was silent, illuminated only by the faint light of a single lamp burning in the chief scholar's office. Jian found Master Wang exactly where he expected him, hunched over the Mandate of Heaven scroll. The crimson lacquer box lay open, and the ancient silk was spread across the scholar's massive writing desk. Wang looked older, his face etched with strain. "You have returned, Jian," he whispered, his voice thick with relief. He didn't ask how. "I heard of the patrols in the hunting park. Wei is a snape. He suspects more than he knows." Jian pulled the damp pouch of shimmering dark powder from his boot. "It is the ghost ink of Mount Li," he announced, placing it gently on the desk. Hong's eyes, usually distant with intellectual thought, now fixed on the pigment with fervent intensity. "Good, Jian. Now the final, most essential service you will ever render the dynasty. The unholy task." The chief scholar had already prepared a thin, colorless binding agent, a mix of animal glue and water, to adhere the mineral pigment to the ancient silk. "The goal is not to paint over the stain," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "That would crack and be revealed.